The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents, Do They Really Believe That? Now, I was a fundamentalist Christian for more than 25 years. I got saved at the age of 5, walked down the aisle at a revival, and was active in the church throughout my teen years. And I thought that God wanted me to be a preacher. And I had parents who felt that way, and I know other members of the church did too. I wasn't forced to go, well, I was forced to go to church on Sunday mornings because I'm not a morning person. But I was there voluntarily the rest of the time. Sunday night, Monday night visitation, Wednesday night services, Thursday night youth things. I went to summer camps. How many people have seen Jesus Camp? Mine wasn't quite that bizarre, but I did go to summer camps like Windermere, or Camp Windermere down Lake of the Ozarks. And when I was 18 and got out of high school, I was terrified because I thought God wanted me to be a preacher. I was terrified of public speaking, which is incredibly ironic now. And I bolted and went in the Navy, and I was in the Navy for 8 years, got out, ended up in Austin, Texas, where I live now, and eventually lost my job, lost everything, and said, okay, God, if you want me to be a preacher, and now you're punishing me for not doing that, let's do it. And I spent more than a year and a half in study and prayer in the hopes of becoming a preacher. Now, you don't have to go to seminary to be a Baptist preacher. You don't even really have to know that much about anything. You just have to be able to convince people that God chose you to be their preacher. That's how it works. So, I looked back on my life and I thought about what I believed. Now, it's often easy for me to put on my Christian hat. I've argued both sides. I will continue to probably argue both sides. I argue the non-religious side most often because I don't want to benefit the religious side. But I've run into many people who were lifelong atheists who seem befuddled and confused. They don't really believe that stuff, do they? They can't possibly believe that. For people who weren't raised in a particular religious tradition, all of it seems outlandish and strange. It's not just the talking snake, it's every little aspect of it. Surely they didn't believe that. Maybe they're just paying lip service to these ideas. And when I look back at what I believed, I have to say, I don't know. How much of it did I actually believe? And how much of it was me believing in belief, as Dan Dennett would point out, that I believed there was value in saying that I believed this. I believed there was value in acting as if I believed these things. What did I believe? And it's getting harder and harder for me to tell the further I am removed from my time spent believing. The answer, do they really believe this, is probably yes and probably no. And none of us, despite what some of us may do on stage from time to time, can actually read minds as far as we can tell. And so it's a mistake for us to pretend as if we can read minds. To say, oh, you don't really believe that. No, there's no way. You can't possibly believe that. Or to claim that someone's belief is in fact sincere merely because they said so. So I can't tell you what's in somebody else's mind or heart, if you want to go with the religious language. All I can do is take a look at what I believed and what people claim to believe. It's important to remember that Christianity and every other religion isn't just one thing. The Bible's not just one book. It's 66 or more books, if you're Catholic, that are collected together. And there's not just one idea within any of these religions. It's a collection, which means that there are probably, almost certainly, people who believe some things and not other things within any religion. I said before that if you want to find out what's wrong with the First Baptist Church, you can ask the Second Baptist Church. And if you want to find out what's wrong with Christianity, you ask the Jews. And if you want to find out what's wrong with Judaism, you can ask a Muslim, etc. Atheists haven't had to do any work. We just point around and say, yep, you're all right, that they're all wrong, that they don't have good reasons for these things. Assuming that people believe something is a mistake. And it's especially a mistake if you're going to enter a conversation with somebody and what you assume about their beliefs is wrong. One of the biggest mistakes you can make is saddling a Protestant with Catholic beliefs. You were raised primarily around Catholics, and so this idea of an actual transubstantiation where the cracker literally, in reality turns into the body of Christ, only Catholics believe that in that sense. And so if you go to a Protestant and watch them, having their version of a Eucharist ceremony and you think, look at them, cannibals. We didn't think that. The Southern Baptists looked at the Catholics and said that was a cult. They're the cult of Marian saints. They don't have a real religion. They've had this poisoned and polluted by the church. And this, as a Southern Baptist, I was taught this, and we don't have the same ideas. Well, if I can't just assume what you think, what should I do? Hey, I could ask you what you think. And now, while I can't get to what you actually think, I can at least address what you claim to think. So, looking at the Genesis account of the universe, that can lead to a lot of different conclusions. The more literalist view, the more fundamentalist view, might lead to a young Earth interpretation where the Earth is somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years old. And we know that that's not the case, and so it seems bizarre, and it seems like a point that's very easy to attack. But it can also lead to the day-age creationists, the people who think that when the Bible says a day, it didn't mean a 24-hour day, it meant some undefined time span. That God did this, and it took some amount of time that we called a day. And it can lead to a mix of those because it's not clear. Is the Bible, is Genesis, is this story about our origins, is this man's attempt to describe an origin that they believe is something that comes from a God? Is it inspired by a God? Is it actually written by a God, as I heard one preacher say recently? No, the King James Bible, actually written by God. I don't think that is as accurate. I'm pretty sure that you've taken literal just a little too literally. Is this our best attempt to explain things? Is it a demonstration of our ignorance? There may not be a single clear or right answer to any of this, which is how we end up with over 1,000 denominations that identify as Christian, and even more once we get outside of Christianity and start looking at Judaism and Islam, and that's just the Abrahamic religions. There are as many different views about God and what God wants and what God thinks as there are people sitting in pews. Now, while there may not be a single clear right answer, and you'll have all sorts of arguments about what is the correct interpretation of this passage, there are, at least within the Bible, some areas that seem to be more obviously intended to be taken at face value than others. And if you interpret the Genesis story as a story of Satan creating the world, you've got a lot of work to do to convince anybody that you're actually right. You're too far afield of what it says. While there may be room to move around in there and say, well, maybe this wasn't about God actually forming Adam out of some dirt. Maybe this is ancient man's metaphor for from the earth, God brought forth and breathed life into Adam. Some passages, thou shalt not kill, probably intended to be viewed at face value. And so you can use that as an opportunity to say, why isn't thou shalt not suffer a witch to live still viewed in the same frame as thou shalt not kill? They sound very much the same, and they both give the impression that these are instructions for what you shouldn't do. Hey, you shouldn't kill people unless they're witches. That seems kind of straightforward, and yet almost nobody is running around killing witches, at least not in the United States. So if we have some passages that are literal or read at face value and others that are metaphoric and everybody can just make up their own justification, then what do we know about what people believe? I think the only thing that demonstrates is that people believe that they can make this say whatever they want. Advocates for a particular position, literal or otherwise, actually need to be made to clearly state what it is they believe and then offer the justification for it. Oh, you think there was a talking snake? That's interesting. Can you tell me why you think that's the case? Most of the time, you're going to find that the answer is because that's what the Bible says, or that's what my holy book says, or because that's what God has revealed to me. But what did I believe about Genesis? I don't know. I'm not sure, because I remember being okay with the idea of evolution, even though I probably thought God interacted in the process in some fuzzy way. I'm not even sure I had any more of a good understanding of evolution at that time than I did about God's potential interactions with it. But what I would take away from Genesis wasn't there was a man and a woman, and God created them, and there was a talking snake in the 6 days of creation, and this all needs to be taken literally. I think, despite being a fundamentalist Southern Baptist, I probably most of the time view Genesis as, hey, what's the important message to take away from this? God created a world, we messed it up, now we're going to pay for it. That's the important message. And the facts within Genesis don't make much difference to that message, whether it's a metaphor for our corruption or it's an actual literal description of what happened, doesn't change the takeaway. This is one of the best functions that religions have exploited. You need to have claims that are ambiguous enough that they can be interpreted in different ways so that they are potentially unfalsifiable. There's no way to show that they're wrong. The more specific you get, Thor hurls lightning bolts, or Zeus does. Zeus hurls lightning bolts. The more specific you get, the more easy it becomes to show that you're probably not correct. However God did it, and that was good enough for me. That was the bumper sticker. God said it, I believe it, that's good enough for me. Or, God did it, that's good enough for me. But my view of Genesis was probably muddled, and it definitely changed over time. And I clearly never had a good reason to believe, and yet I was always convinced with each new version of the Genesis story in my head that I did have a good reason to believe. Well, what other beliefs from my past seem strange? Talking snakes? That's not good enough. Let's have talking donkeys. That's in there. Jonah and the great fish. Don't call it a whale. They'll correct you, so just get used to saying great fish right off the bat. It says great fish, not a whale. And then when you point out that you knew that it was a great fish and that it wasn't a whale, that it was just a great fish, you can then ask them, what difference does it make if it was a whale or a great fish? We're talking about a man who lived inside of one for a while. If you're going to nitpick over whether or not I call it a whale, by the way, whale would seem more reasonable. I mean, if there's got to be room to move around in there, hopefully. What about the plagues? Does any of that make sense? Rivers of blood, let's kill the firstborn, locusts. Are these, real things that happened? We know that the Exodus almost certainly didn't happen. The archaeological evidence demonstrates that there's nothing to support the idea that Jews were held captive, certainly not in the numbers that the Bible supports. By the way, if you lined everybody up who was supposedly escaping Egypt and had them hand to hand, they would stretch from where they were supposedly imprisoned all the way to where they ended up, which makes you wonder why they had to wander around for 40 years when they could have just formed a line and passed everything down. Instead of walking many abreast, did a sea actually part and they walked on dry land? Do you believe that? I don't know. Something like that. I believe something like that. What about Noah? Was the whole earth flooded, or was it just a local flood? Well, it depends on which Christian you talk to. There are plenty who say, no, it's not a global flood, it's just a local flood. Well, if that's the case, please explain the rest of your theology, because your book's purpose for the flood was to purge the entire world of the sinful and save this family of 8 to be God's new representatives. A drunk who cursed one of his sons to be the offspring of his sons to be slaves of his other sons. A drunk guy was the best person God could find to build a boat, put all the animals on it, and save humanity. The world must have been pretty crappy. I mean, I don't want to fault Noah for his substance addiction, but I mean, by and large, if that's the absolute best you can do, and he supposedly successfully built this boat, it all makes sense. Well, the Bible doesn't say it was kinds. It was kinds of animals. So maybe there was like one canine kind that, spawned all of the dogs since then? So what you believe is you say evolution's wrong, but you're okay with really, really fast evolution. Like, we only needed a handful of animals on the boat. Well, if God can do the other stuff, then he can magic the animals. And that's the key. Once you begin with the idea that there is a God who can do anything, it's laughably easy to then accept that there's a talking snake, that we've got a bunch of animals on a boat, that we flooded the entire earth, even though that doesn't seem possible. That a few generations after this global flood, there's a whole bunch of people who are building a tower You have a civilization that has managed to go from 8 people to enough people to build a city who feel the need to build a tower so that they're never parted. And they focus all their energy on that. By the way, I've spoken before about how that's a great story of how God hates humanists. Because if you actually read what the text says, it doesn't say that they were being punished for their vanity or their attempt to build a tower to heaven. It said, hey, let's build this tower so that we can communicate and so that we can be one community. And God basically looked down and said, no, we can't have that. If we allow you to be one community, there is nothing you won't be able to achieve. So let's mess up your languages and send you scattering to the winds. God hates cooperation. Which is pretty telling, because that sounds like a really good idea to me. Hey, let's get together as one community. Let's unite. There's nothing we can't accomplish. And God says, yep, you're right. There's nothing you can't accomplish, so let's put an end to that. Did I believe that God came down and wrestled people? I don't know. Did I think that you could change the genetic structure of sheep depending on what sticks they were looking at when they were mating, or what you happened to brush them with, so that you could end up with striped sheep? This is one of the things that basically convinced my wife at a very young age that Christianity couldn't possibly be true, because she loved genetics and she loves Punnett squares. She's a microbiologist now. And when she read that passage, she was like, that's bullshit. It just doesn't work like that. What about God wanting to kill Moses and then backing off because they circumcised his newborn kid and threw the foreskin at God's feet? Or at Moses' feet, which might have actually been throwing it at Moses' genitals if you listen to David Fitzgerald. I don't know. Let's get out of the Old Testament. What about the loaves and fishes miracles, or raising the dead? What about the zombies marching on Jerusalem? You know, when Jesus is being crucified, the dead get up from their graves and march on Jerusalem. I mean, I haven't actually watched Walking Dead yet. I'm looking forward to watching it. But I tend to view it as fiction. And yet the Bible pretty much has this idea that a bunch of people got out of their graves and marched on Jerusalem, as if there wasn't enough crap going wrong right then. We got to deal with the walking dead. I don't know what I believed about that. Maybe it's just that because God can do anything, all of this stuff made sense. As soon as you've given yourself over to this idea that magic is real, that there are things that can violate the laws of nature, and there's one being who's doing it, and he's got a plan, it all makes sense. And even when the miracles go away, seemingly they decline in proportion to our ability to investigate them. You know, like when we start getting video cameras, and all of a sudden there's a lot fewer miracles than before we had the ability to record things. Before we had good scientific investigation, there were miracles everywhere, and now all of a sudden, you know, you've got Joe Nickel trying to debunk the Shroud of Turin seemingly every other week or so, because somebody has done it, looked at it again. We've looked at it again, and yes, now we're sure it's blood. Okay, what can you tell us about that blood? Well, now we're sure that it's the blood, and so the images of someone who's clearly male, but the blood would lead us to conclude parthenogenesis. So wait, so Jesus was female? No, that's the miracle part. That's the miracle part, okay. There is a time and a place for mockery and ridicule. And not everybody accepts that. I think that ridiculous ideas are by definition deserving of ridicule. But there's a difference between ridiculing ideas and ridiculing people who hold those ideas. Now, I can't tell you what's actually in somebody's mind. I have met people who have claimed to believe almost any absurd thing in the Bible or out of the Bible. And I can't read their minds. And there are many cases where I understand the temptation to say, you're never going to change their mind. There's no amount of evidence you can throw at them that's going to change their mind. There may be people for whom that's correct, but there are certainly also people for whom that's not correct. And I don't know how to tell the difference between those people until I actually talk to them. And that's why I spend time talking to them. We're talking about people here, and if you don't care about what people believe, or you don't think you have any hope of changing their mind, then I don't know why you would feel the need to engage. But I'm an atheist because I'm a skeptic. But I talk about this stuff because I'm a humanist, because I care about what kind of world we live in, because people's beliefs, whether they actually believe it or they are just acting as if they believe it, those beliefs inform actions, and those actions have consequences for them and for the rest of us as well. So when we're engaging on these topics, can we just point out the flaws? Can we just say, you know, the earth can't be 10,000 years old, and here's the evidence for it? Absolutely, you can do that. How effective is it? I don't know. Sometimes it's probably really effective. I had conversations with people who don't seem to understand what they actually believe, can't express it very clearly, and when asked to give the reason why, you don't get much. And in those cases, if you can provide actual evidence, if you can actually falsify their position, by all means do it. But it may not be all you need to do, because you don't know if they consider their holy book to be the literal word of God or the inspired word of God. How perfect do they consider the Bible? Not everybody thinks the Bible is perfect. I remember Ray Comfort called into the show one time, and I challenged him on the slavery issue, and he said, well, I don't believe everything in the Bible. I had made the assumption that Ray, who was making incredibly horrible arguments, and who seemed to be like every other biblical literalist that I'd ever met, not that any of them are true literalists, I just assumed that if it was in the Bible, he was willing to defend it. And then he comes out of the blue and says, well, you know, not everything in the Bible. I don't believe everything in the Bible. Which is great to know, and I wish I'd have known before I brought that up, because that allows me to ask the question, hey Ray, how do you tell which parts of the Bible you should believe and which parts you shouldn't? That's the best question you can ask. It's the reason there are over 1,000 denominations that all identify as Christian and all point to the Bible. You can't assume that because Joe is a Christian, that Joe believes everything every other Christian you've met believes. Yes, they probably believe in a God. Believe it or not, I've run across some people who identify as Christian who don't believe that a God exists. I have met ministers at Methodist churches who are open atheists. I'm still working on that one. I'm trying to sort through how that works. But they probably believe in God. They probably view Jesus as part of or somehow connected to God. And they probably believe that we are sinners in need of salvation. But that doesn't mean that they buy into these sinners in the hands of an angry God mentality. There was someone who called the show last week who seemed confused as to why I would object to the Bible. And it came out very quickly that he hadn't actually read the Bible. Oh, well, he'd read parts of it. Great. I've read the whole thing several times and studied it quite a bit. And I can fully understand how if you only read parts of it, you could have warm, fuzzy feelings. I don't understand what your real justification is for believing, other than this feels good, or people around me believe. And so we started going through, and we talked about, well, you know, if you think the Bible is a good moral book, why does it support slavery? The Bible doesn't support, yes, it does. Exodus 21, you should go read it. And he added that to his homework list of things to go read. We talked about how the Bible forces a rapist to marry his rape victim and pay the shekels, and that he can't ever divorce her. And he was dumbfounded that this was in the Bible. And I asked him, I'm like, how can you possibly be advocating for the Bible as a good book when you haven't read it? Well, it's not just one book, it's 66 books. Yeah, it is. Please point to the ones that you think are good, and if I agree with you that the content is good, then we're in agreement. Keep the good wherever you find it. There are good things in the Bible. There are good things in almost any book. I don't know for sure, but I would imagine there's probably a sentence in Mein Kampf I agree with. Maybe. What Christianity is today is not what it was 50 years ago or 100 years ago or 500 years ago. It's not what it was 2,000 years ago. And it's more wide-ranging in the collection of beliefs that you're going to find with anybody you interact with. There are people out there who believe almost anything, it seems. And everybody in this room is one of those people. I don't mean that we are all extremely gullible so that everything that, we could potentially believe everything that we hear. It's just that there's none of us who are perfectly rational. We're all going to have some belief that we got wrong, that we hold for bad reasons. And recognizing that we do this and that, hey, this belief might not be as bad as this other belief, it's a good thing, but it's also deceptive. Because when you say, oh, the thing that I believe that might be wrong doesn't really hurt anybody, there's still a thought process in your brain that led you to that conclusion, and you have no good reason to think that that thought process wouldn't be used to assess other claims, to lead you to other false beliefs. Using critical thinking, applying the tools of critical thinking and using skepticism to evaluate claims, it's a tool set and it's a full-time job. When I gave up my beliefs, when I couldn't continue to point to the Bible as the source for why I believe things, I had to go through and evaluate it and say, okay, what do I believe now and why? That's a lot of work. It's much easier just to take what somebody says to you and keep going. And the weird thing is, most of the Christians that you run across, and perhaps believers in other religions as well, but I'll talk about Christianity as it's what I'm most familiar with and what's prevalent here, and we're talking about what's in the Bible, most of them don't know very much about what they believe. They don't know very much about their holy book. They don't know very much about the origins of their religion. They know what they've been taught. They know what felt right to them. They know what worked in the church that they were in. And they have some vague, warm, fuzzy feeling about it. Most of them haven't actually read the book, at least not all of it, because as soon as everybody gets to the begats, it's begover. Why would I need to keep reading after that? Why is that even included in there? That's just bizarre. If my religion is telling me that this is a book that's supposed to be used as a manuscript, a guide to help you with your everyday life, why do I care who sired who? That's just bizarre. But I actually met somebody who claimed they had all of them memorized, like they have every verse memorized. And I said, even the begats? And yes, even the begats. Cool. When they Bible trivia games, you're the guy I want on my team. They bought into sermons, they bought into the feelings, they bought into the culture, and they just assumed that so many people couldn't possibly be so wrong for so long. And yet we know that that is in fact false. They can have been wrong for that long. They've accepted what the priest, the preacher, or the pastor has said, and almost no Christian church is actually about the Bible. Most Christian churches aren't even about Jesus. The core of Christian churches now primarily comes from what Paul had to say, and then we take the bits and pieces from Jesus that are convenient to the broader message that Paul expounded upon. Churches today that identify even as Bible churches aren't so much about the actual Bible as interpreting the Bible. I wish they would start with the verse that says, let God be true and every man a liar, because that demonstrates that all of these interpretations and all of these views and doctrines about the Bible can't be correct, and that we can't tell which of them might possibly be correct until some God comes down and clears it up for us, which is why so many of them claim that God has cleared it up for them, and they all disagree. They'll tell common stories and they'll talk about a need for salvation in their church, but much of the time is spent trying to convince people that this ancient collection of books is somehow relevant to their everyday life. Because without that, it becomes what it actually is, mythology. As soon as it loses that communal connection, as soon as it loses that relevance, that this passage tells me something significant about who I am that I can put to use today, that's when it is relegated to the pile of mythology that we have. So how do we reach people? That may not be everybody's goal, by the way. Have whatever goal you want. If you want to argue with people because you want to show how much more you know about their religion than they do, okay, I don't know that you're doing that much good, but you can have fun doing that. I do what I do because I care about what kind of world we live in. It's derived from my humanism, as I mentioned. So when I talk about how to reach people, one of the best tools is to ask them what they believe and why. And the why is the most important part. And when I ask questions and I'm trying to engage with someone, I'm actually interested in their answer. I'm not just waiting for my turn to speak. I'm not just, oh, they said Genesis. Let me boot up the mat memory on Genesis so that I can point to, oh, you believe in talking snakes. I want to know, what do you believe and why? Now, I may lose my patience very quickly because it may become clear that I'm talking to someone who doesn't really know. And the best thing I can do at that point is say, look, you don't seem to really have a good understanding of what you believe or why. Why don't you go think about it and get back to me? Now, this is the thing. People have said, oh, you're just like the fundamentalists that you argue against. No, I don't make outgoing calls on the show. I don't go door to door. I engage with the people who want to engage. And this brings up another distinction when you're interacting with people. Things are fundamentally different when you're interacting one-on-one with someone than when you have an audience. Now, I prefer an audience. I'd love to reach as many people as possible. And when I'm having a public debate at a university or when I'm on the phone with someone at the TV show, I'm not necessarily trying to convince them. I'm trying to convince the people that are watching. Because we know enough about people watching that if the person they agree with is embarrassing themselves, if they are looking foolish, if they are doing a poor job of defending it, the person who shares those beliefs feels that pain, but they don't suffer from the disadvantage of having been the actual one who was publicly embarrassed. And that allows them the opportunity, if they want to take it, to rethink why they believe. Hey, how would I have argued this better? Have a goal in having the conversation. Realize that you're not going to change anybody's mind right away, most of the time. If your goal is something that is worthy, that'll be obvious. I can tell you, if you come up against a believer, and like I was saying earlier, if you use Catholic ideas when you're arguing with a Protestant, they get to disregard everything you say because you don't know what you're talking about. They shouldn't, because you can be wrong about that one thing and right about everything else, but they get to do that. That's the defense mechanisms that we all have and religions exploit, is that guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Oh, she just wants to sin. She just wants to do this, he just wants to do that. They have some motive, and we use that, and religious people use it as an excuse to ignore the substantive things that they've been challenged on. Now, the guy who called in last week, who decided to go do his homework, I have no idea what will happen to him. I don't know what was actually in his mind, and he had a difficult time expressing it. I'd be happy to take another call from him. I'd love to hear what happened. I'd like to hear, hey, I went off and researched this Bible thing, and here's the answer that you seem to have overlooked and why I still believe, because that allows us to move the conversation on a step further. Because Christian apologetics exists to explain away, or attempt to explain away, all of the objections that we launch on a regular basis to their doctrines, to the theology, and to what's in their holy book. But in the end, what he actually believed wasn't as important as why he believed it. And when the foundations crumble for why you believe something, those beliefs go away. You can struggle, and you can watch people actually do this. I love watching people think, and I love making people think, which is why I love doing the show. You can hear those pauses, and I can almost picture a work crew in somebody's head saying, oh my gosh, the bridge is about to fall. Let's start propping it up here. What can we use? Grab anything you've got. Let's throw everything at it and try and keep this thing stable. And I just kind of sit back and go, that's about to fall over. You don't have enough braces to put that up. And when the bridge crumbles, there are people who are going to sit there and say, nope, the bridge is still there. Yes, the emperor definitely has clothes on. And maybe you can't reach them. But maybe somebody else can. Because I have this idea that, for example, the first time you hear an idea expressed that seems foreign and strange, you're probably, if you're skeptical, if you've been burned by bad ideas in the past, you probably have a wall up. Nope, that idea, that's too weird, too strange. And then the second time you hear it, it's like, wow, that's weird, because this other person had said that thing. Maybe there's something there, but no. And then the third time you hear it, now all of a sudden you're spotting a trend. It takes 3 to get us to a trend. That's why 3 on a match is considered bad luck. The first one, hey, there was something over there. Second one, oh, I think it's right about there. The third one, yep, boom, you're dead. That's a war example, which might have flown over some people's heads. I should have been more clear. But if you're going to interact with one person, please, I hope, you're doing it because you care about what they think. And you're free to say, you know what, I'm not trying to insult you, but when I ask you if you really believe this, it's because in my head, it just seems so outlandish. And when I've heard Christians in the past talk about feeding the masses with 5 loaves and fishes, I just always assumed that they kind of went, yeah, well, we believe that. But you actually believe it, and I'd like to know why. What is it about it? Because you can't read minds. But what's in people's minds matters. And so the only way to get to it is to talk to them and ask questions. And if your goal is to just make them look foolish, well, congratulations, there's plenty of space for you on the internet. Happens all the time. Oh, the religiotards. That language drives me nuts. Now, yes, some people really do believe all the things that we find ridiculous. And there are people in this room who believe things that somebody else in this room finds ridiculous. That is something that I keep in my mind when I'm hearing from the guy who's had visitations from aliens for most of his life, as I heard just a few weeks ago on the show. And I keep that in mind when somebody's talking about how Jesus helped them find their car keys, or how they cured their mom's cancer, or how they just feel it. Because beliefs matter, but I don't have access to them. All I have access to is what people say they believe. And if I can show that what they say they believe is in conflict with what they do, if they're acting in a way that is clearly in conflict with what they say they believe, that causes a disconnect in their head that allows them to go back and say, wait a minute, do I actually believe this, or am I just kind of acting as if I believe it? Or maybe I wasn't even acting as if I believe it. Maybe I just said I believed it, and I wasn't really sure about it. And that's the kind of conversations that we saw last week, to keep using that one example. So why not use the Socratic method, which I think is the best tool we have? You're never going to learn anything more strongly than when you learned it yourself. When you had that eureka, aha moment yourself. And so the Socratic method of asking people questions, ultimately leading them towards something, it's not dishonest. It's not a trick. There are people who, when they call in the show, you're asking me trick questions. No, I'm just exposing the problems with the answers that you began with. That's not a trick. Asking you to justify what you believe is not a trick. And everybody isn't going to be reachable, certainly not on the first go. But if you actually point out to people where they haven't adequately defended their belief, when you demonstrate that since they believe and you don't, they have a burden of proof for the positive claim that they're making, they have the obligation to try to convince you, they should have the obligation to try to convince anyone. And we do this to get them to realize errors, but also with the recognition that we could be wrong. And if they do, in fact, have a good reason for their belief, then we should accept that too. And I try to do as much of this as I can from the standpoint of humanism, of demonstrating that I don't think that somebody's stupid, that my IQ didn't go up when I stopped believing. I just had different access to different information and viewed it from a different angle. That while I may believe that their particular views are stupid, that I don't necessarily think they're stupid. I'm not trying to attack their character. It's difficult to do because these things go to the core of people's identity. Just merely my existence, the fact that there's someone out there who does not believe in Jesus will freak some people out. And there's no reason that it should, because the Bible explicitly tells them that they're supposed to be out there talking to the people who don't believe. And yet they're freaked out by the fact that I exist, probably more freaked out by the fact that I won't shut up about it. This idea of going into these conversations and saying, I just really find it difficult to believe that you believe what you say you believe. That's okay. That's not, oh my gosh, you're so stupid, that's wrong. The earth is not 10,000 years old. Here's a bunch of scientific information. There are people that can be reached by that in the same way that there are people who give up their belief in Santa Claus because they went out and explored on their own, and there are others who were ridiculed on the bus on the way to school. Oh, you still believe that? Multiple methods can work. But when I talk to people, both former believers, but in many cases, lifelong atheists, they just don't seem to be able to grasp the concept that people actually believe this stuff. Come on, Matt. Yeah, you were a believer, but you didn't really believe. Yeah, a lot of it, I pretty much did. I was betting my life on it, even though I was making a bad bet, even though I didn't have good reason. I would have told you I had good reasons. I would have probably argued with you and debated with you. Oh, but you didn't really believe like a talking snake. I mean, you have snakes. They don't talk. Yes, but I don't have a talking snake. I don't have a snake that may have been taken over by the spirit of a supernatural being. Well, why do you think that's real? Because God can do anything. And that's the key. Whether they believe it, whether I believed it, whether we just believed in believing it, there was a foundational belief that there was a guy, and it's almost always a guy, who exists outside of space and time, who has a plan and can do anything, and as soon as you accept that, everything is possible. Talking snakes are nothing. So don't focus as much on the belief, even though they're important. Focus more on the why. And do it by focusing on the person that you're talking to. And from my experience, and others may differ, that's probably the most effective way of getting people to realize that their story, that their feelings, are not at all different from all the members of the Clergy Project who've lost their religious views, all the members of the secular community who were once religious, which is most people, and that maybe it's okay for them to give up those beliefs as well. Getting the permission and being forced to defend your position might be all it takes to creating a world full of secular people who reject unfounded religious dogma. Thanks.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.